Hi there, this is the Common Magician. I've got something to show you. I've got a deck of cards here. They're in no particular order. Just to be certain of that, we can give them a shuffle. In fact, I'm going to give them to you, if you wouldn't mind shuffling the cards. Once you're done shuffling the cards and you're satisfied that they're all mixed up to your liking, I would ask you to just set them down on the table and give them a spread. Go ahead and spread them out. So far you've done all of this work. I want you to right now just reach in there. I'm going to turn my back. I want you to slide out any card that you want. Okay, I'm not going to look. Just go ahead and reach in and slide out any card that you want. You would do that, and then I would ask you, with my back turned, to go ahead and square up the rest of the cards. And then what I'd have you do is I want you to take that card, and I want you to show it to everybody else. Again, I won't look, so I'll turn my back here very quickly, and you can show that card to everybody else, just to be certain that nobody in this room can pull a fast one on me. Everybody's seen what the card is, and I can't be tricked myself in any way. We're going to keep everybody honest in this little experiment. Now what I want you to do is we're going to get this back into the deck, but what I'll have you do is I'll have you shuffle it again. So I'm just going to give you the cards. You go ahead and shuffle them again to make it fair. Once you're done shuffling, go ahead and set them down on the table, spread them out, and then slide your card back in anywhere that you want. Go ahead and square the deck up, and I might even have you shuffle again. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and shuffle the cards one more time just to make sure that everything is mixed to your liking. Once you've done that, I'd ask you to set the cards back down on the table, and then I would turn back around again, and we'll continue with our little bit of an experiment here. So far, let me review. You have shuffled the cards. Yes? You selected a card from the deck that you shuffled. I didn't even touch it. You showed it to everybody else to make sure that everybody knows what it is. You shuffled the cards again and then placed the card back into the deck at any point of your choosing. Correct? Then you shuffled them again. This cannot be more fair. And you can examine the cards and you can see that they're completely normal. I'm going to somehow find your card. Okay? So if you watch very carefully here, I'm going to see if I can locate your card. Okay, so we're going to look at a concept here today and talk about it in depth, as I tend to do on these videos. So just a quick disclaimer here. This is going to be a long discussion, and it is a discussion because you're free to put your comments in the comments section. A good all-around learning experience when we share our ideas with each other. So I certainly invite you to do that at the end of this, to share your thoughts and your comments or your insights. Some of you often will come up with insights that you have, things that you've read or found other places that relate to what we're talking about and can help others out as they're looking at this video. But this is going to be a discussion. This is not a tutorial in the classic sense. This is not going to be a 5-minute, here's a method, have at it kind of thing. We're going to talk about crimps. I've wanted to do this for a long time because crimping, card crimping, is probably one of the very best methods out there to accomplish a wide variety of things with a deck of cards. You can use crimps, that is the act of bending a card in such a way that it can be identified against other cards. And it may not just mean that either, as we'll find here in a moment. I've wanted to do this in a long time because it could be the only thing you do, and you can do, hours of magic for people just with this one sort of principle in play, and nothing else. So it's one of those things. The other thing about card crimping, using crimps in your magic, is that it can be done right in front of the spectator. It's not a complicated thing to do. It doesn't require very complicated sleights. There are some sort of open moves to it that have to be covered and misdirected in a certain way. But in general, the concept of crimping or bending a card is really beyond the mind of a spectator to consider when they're watching card magic. If for no other reason, many people assume that if you bend a card, you ruin it. And that can be true, but it also need not be true with the kinds of bends that we're talking about, these sorts of crimps. Cards are made out of plastic and paper. They're paper at the core. There's actually 3 layers with glue in between. There's a glue layer. So you have 2 layers with a black kind of glue sort of layer in the middle so that you don't have any light shining through so as to identify a card inadvertently in a card game. And then there is a plastic coat on modern cards. And when I say modern cards, we're talking about cards that have been made for decades and decades now. Cards have been made this way for quite some time. And it could be smooth finish. It could be a sort of a fake linen finish, as cards tend to have and have had for, many, many years now. It doesn't really matter, but that plastic, what it does is it allows you to put a bend into a card that really has a memory that can be retained. So you can bend a card, pretty aggressively without creasing it, and that will work its way right back out again. You can work that bend out, that crimp, and the card is just as it was before. So crimps are non-destructive things, really. Now, over time, it is true that if you crimp and crimp and crimp and crimp and crimp your cards, that they will start to get warped and they won't lay together quite as well anymore, and it becomes harder and harder to do crimped effects. So there is that. It's just as if you were shuffling cards very aggressively. They will warp over time such that you can't really get them to lay straight and flat anymore. So there is that. There is a sense in which crimping over time can sort of wear them down, but it doesn't ruin cards, not really, not in any real sense. There are types of crimps that you can lay into, and particularly in gambling, and cheating, card cheating, that might ruin a card, and that's to identify a card such that you can see the card if someone else is holding it, or if you deal it out, you know where it's going. But that's not what we're discussing here. We're talking about these temporary sorts of crimps. Another way that a crimp can ruin a card is you can lay in a crimp so deeply, particularly with a specific kind of crimp that we put into the center of the card called a breather. And I will try to remember to put a link to a segment that I talk about breathers on this video in the description. You can put a breather crimp into a card that is permanent, that really can't be worked out, and will change that card essentially forever. We're not going to focus much on those. We're going to talk on this video about the impromptu, in-the-moment application of bends and crimps in cards in order to find them again or to denote location or separation in the pack where it would be advantageous for us to do so. So let's start with the effect that we just looked at. Usually I will show an effect and then have a long discussion, and then I will go back at the very end and I'll go over what I did in the beginning, sort of kind of tease you along. But I'm actually going to get this one out of the way first because it's a very aggressive, broad sort of application of a crimp. That doesn't affect one card, but actually affects the entire deck. So let's take a look at that first effect and the very general principle of a crimp here as it applies to the whole deck, and then we'll break it down as we go through the discussion in the video, and we'll look at various other types of crimps and their applications. Okay, so this effect that I showed you is an extremely fair presentation, and that's what would be most puzzling to people. I wouldn't say that this is a magician fooler, but there's probably a context in which a magician wouldn't pick up on what's going on here. It is possible. Even magicians don't think of crimps. They tend to think of crimps as they are applied with a breather crimp. The breather crimp is probably the most used crimp. But magicians really do stumble up on the use of crimps, as we'll look later on, that are one called a corner crimp or an edge crimp, some kind of crimp that's laid into a card in an impromptu act and then used for separation later on. This is the big tell for a breather, though. Whenever you see a magician dead cut the deck and then they show a card, or they show a card here, and it's a revelation, it's a correct demonstration of a card that was selected, a true demonstration at the end, that is a telltale sign for a magician that a crimp was employed. However, if a crimp is used as a key card, sort of buried in the routine as a means of separating and then controlling a card to a location that's advantageous for later on, that's a little bit harder to see. That's a better use of a crimp, a breather crimp in particular. So this could fool people. Some of you may not have been fooled. Maybe you understood what was going on here. But this would not be the first thing I think that most magicians would think about in a routine like this. I've seen one marketed effect recently that works on a very similar principle. I'm not even going to name it because I don't want to be rude to the creator. But it's a totally different presentation, totally different outcome. It doesn't really work the same way in terms of what the effect is. However, the principle underlying is quite closely related to this. So here's what's going on. And you'll kick yourself if you didn't figure this out. What I'm doing is I'm taking the deck, and this would be done ahead of, before the camera rolled, this was actually set up. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give the entire deck a really aggressive bend. Now, this is not unusual. You will notice that a lot of table card men, card people that use cards for kind of gambling demonstrations and table magic, they often will have a deck that looks like this. It's got a fairly stark bend in the center of it. And what that comes from is it comes from this sort of riffling over and over again. That's where that gets developed. And this can be useful in table card magic because of crimps. If you crimp something the other way and you give something to bend in the opposite way, it can be found very easily. We're going to utilize this sort of thing that happens naturally in table sorts of magic with cards, but we're going to do it in the hands, and we're going to make an opposition bend here that's going to be very, very useful. I don't know where you would find this written in a book. If you look like in Expert Card Technique, you'll see in there that there's only 2.5 pages devoted to crimping at all. It's a pretty direct concept and direct topic of discussion that doesn't really take a lot of exposition, really, to understand it. So I've not really seen this employed, other than to say I've seen it in gambling types of card cheating situations where you would put what's called a bridge into the deck. So in Expert at the Card Table, there's a section in there, we're going to talk about this later on too, where you would bend the bottom pack over the top pack such that you would create a little bridge in there that could be set for a confederate, someone that's helping you to cut and nullify a cut after a shuffle. So that's one place where you'll see it. We're going to do something similar to that. So the way this begins is we need to get a convex bend from the top perspective. This can be done right in front of the spectator. One way that it can be done is if the cards are riffle shuffled, like this, and you give a really, really firm bridge at the end. You can create an upward bend. Likewise, you can hold it in biddle grip, and you can actually bend the deck, kind of in half like this, in such a way that it's not seen. Ultimately, the best way to do this is to just play with the cards in hand with a lot of hand cover and give it a bend while you're misdirecting and having a discussion, and you're not really focusing on the cards. You can talk about something else, give it a bend, maybe cut it so that you can even out the two halves. But either way, you want to bend this way, you want to bend this way, you want to cut and do it again and bend both ways so that you've created that convex sort of warp to the cards. If it's noticed, it really isn't a big deal. It's again, it's not something anybody really pays attention to. So be aggressive with it and put a really big bend in there. Now what you're going to do is you're going to go real gentle on the cards. You don't want to do a riffle shuffle, and you don't want the spectator to do it either. If the spectator does this, it'll ruin the effect. But what you're going to do is you're going to have them shuffle, and the way you do this is you say, could you please mix the cards, just to demonstrate that they're mixed up. So you show them an overhand shuffle, have them do it once and say, that's great. Could you please spread the cards on the table? Or you can spread it for them. And you're all set to go. You're going to have them, give them the directions that I gave you. You'll have them take a card out and slide it out say slide it out, and then square up the cards. You're going to turn around, you're going to pick up the deck, and you're going to say, now what I want you to do is I want you to show this card to everybody else. So they're going to pick it up, and while they're showing it to everybody else, what you're going to do while your back is turned, again, or while you're looking away or not paying attention, everybody's focusing on this card, is you're going to give a bend. So what you're going to do is you're going to bend upward and cut, upward, cut, and then bend this way and cut, like that, so that you've given a bend in the opposite direction in both ways. So you have a convex bend on this card and a concave bend on the rest of the deck. Again, do not be gentle. Really lay it in hard, and you can see the difference between the two. Now, what you would do is you turn around and say, in fact, why don't you go ahead and give these a shuffle? You pass them back to the specter. They can shuffle them. Say, go ahead and set them on the table and spread them out. Now, if these were sitting side by side, you would notice this discrepancy. But when they're spread like this, you don't really take note of that. It's not really anything that anybody's thinking about, even if they did see it. You'll give the instructions, say, please go ahead and slide it in anywhere that you want. Hopefully they go kind of central. That'll make things easier later. And then say, go ahead and square it up. And then if you want to take a bit of a risk, you can say, why don't you go ahead and give them another mix? Again, if they're doing an overhand shuffle, everything will be okay. It really shouldn't harm anything about the situation. Now, I'm actually going to leave it right where it's at because something interesting has happened. Have them leave the deck on the table, turn back around. What you're going to need to do is you're going to need to find it. You're going to need to find the break. Now, you can find the break by holding the cards kind of perpendicular here to the ground, and then just kind of relax, and you'll actually note what happened in my shuffle is that the crimp card ended up on the bottom. See, this is what we call the crimp card because it's the one card that's different from all the rest. This is just kind of a lucky break here, that it's at the bottom. It probably will be somewhere else, but you can just see if I relax, you'll see that it wants to pop open at that spot. What I want to do is I want to get the central. So if it's in the middle, I'm good to go. If it's not central, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, remember, you shuffled the cards. And I'm just going to shuffle off a margin that would put that card somewhat central, because I'm going to do a bit of an estimation here in a moment. Now, once I've done that, I'll set the cards down. I'll say, I'm going to try to find your card. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up. I'm going to do a dead cut, but not as a dead cut. I'm going to do the dead cut in the action of shuffling. What I'm looking for is something very, very subtle. When I dead cut, I know I'm right if I see this card pop up. If I see that, I know I'm right. Now, if I end up hitting a card that's concave, I know that I didn't hit it right. And what I'll need to do is I'll need to pick it up and square it in the hands and see where that opens up again and then set it down and go back. Okay. In fact, I think on the demonstration I did, I had to do that. It didn't work out perfectly the first time. Okay. Again, nobody's suspecting what's going on here, so you have quite a bit of freedom to discover what you need to. So I'll dead cut in. In fact, this is perfect. I can see that this is not correct. This is a convex card, but I can see that the card is underneath. So what I might do is I might shuffle, and then I'll go back. And again, I'm shuffling very lightly because I don't want to ruin my concave card. And if I can look, I can see that it's right here near the top. So it's on the top quarter. I'm going to cut again, and I see it pop up. And then I shuffle in. Now all I need to do is on my shuffles is I need to maintain this crimp card on top. So I'll just do a couple of those. Then I'm going to cut a quarter, cut another quarter, and you can reveal this any way you want. This is just what I did in the demonstration. And I'm holding a break right above my selected card, my crimp card. And then I cut that out, and then I display. So that is the mechanics of what's going on. It's just a crimp, but what we're doing is we are accentuating a crimp that we're putting into a card by crimping the entire deck. And we accentuate it then, after the card is selected, by crimping the entire deck, the remainder of the deck, the other direction, okay, while other things are going on, while a card is being shown. And again, it works out quite nicely that it gives you a very, very clear, easy to find break that can be cut to and then controlled. So that is one extreme application of card crimping by creating a single card bridge. Let's take a look at some other more classic, more sort of typical applications of card crimps. We'll change perspective here for the remainder of our discussion because I think it will be easier to see some of these other ideas from this angle. A couple of quick notes, though, on the previous method. If, by chance, you have a spectator that shuffles the cards like this, don't worry about that. You can still try to get it right. What you will need to do, though, is take note when you take the cards back after card has been selected. Take note of the condition of the cards. If they are concave, or rather convex, you will want to make a concave bend, and you'll want to be more aggressive than usual. Okay, so if after their riffle shuffling, you'll want to get really, really aggressive and get a really good concave sort of bend to the cards. If you get the cards back after they have been shuffled, and you note that the cards are concave, you'll want to reverse what you're doing. So when you take them back, again, under misdirection, as you're giving instructions and having other people look at the cards, you'll want to put a convex bend into the cards, and again, be very aggressive, because even under those circumstances, you can still get a separation in there. Now, just note that this reverses everything. That what you end up with is a crimp that is essentially a regular breather rather than a reverse breather. So when you go to cut, you will probably cut their card to the bottom rather than to the top. So you just need to be aware of that. Reveal it maybe some other way. Just be aware. Now, this also brings up with these crimps. Most crimps are surefire and they will work very well. This particular concept that I'm talking about here, this initial one, where we're giving the whole deck a bend and then reversing the bend, this is less surefire than other crimps. So you're going to want to have a typical out prepared if you can't find it. I always like to go for, at least as transition, to go through the shtick and, show, and they say that's not it. And you say, that would have been a good trick, though, wouldn't it have been? And then you go on, and some people hate that transition, but it usually plays pretty well with people. You can say, obviously, I can't do that. For the first time, what was the name of your card? And then you're set up to continue with a named card reveal of some sort. If you're a fan of moves and palming, you can say, what, the two of spades? Well, no, it can't be the two of spades. I know it's not the two. Actually, I have it right here. I know it's not the two of spades, and then you can call that off and then cop it out and say, there's no two of spades in that deck, and then you can take it out of your pocket. So that's one possibility. Another one is if you carry something that has multiple outs for any card. Something like Colossal Killer, you can actually keep that packed in your wallet such that you can really have an out for any card. You could do that too. I've carried that around as an out, and I've never had to use it, but it's a really great 52 card out that you can go to. Now, you only get to use it once, in a moment. But you want to make sure you have an out prepared. You want to always make sure you have an out prepared when something doesn't go right so that you can transition into something else. But anyway, if they shuffle the cards the wrong way, hope is not lost. Just take note of what condition the cards are in when you get them back, and make sure that you do the opposite to them, and then account for your reveal to work out likewise. Also, don't allow them to shuffle the cards again once you've gotten their card picked. Okay, you might find that you can cut to it pretty fairly. So anyway, that's that. Let's take a look at some other types of crimps that we can use. I have talked at great length on this channel about breather crimps and how I use them, and I think they're a wonderful tool. You can make a breather crimp as a permanent gaff that you keep in your deck. You can do it to a joker, and then you can always use that as a key card to cut to cards and control them. And I, again, will link to some of those, at least one of those discussions on the description for this video, so you can go find that. I'm not going to talk about that right now. However, I do want to mention something that I haven't talked about before that I recall, and that is the impromptu laying in of a breather crimp. This is sort of a sticky subject because Martin Nash is kind of the go-to figure for this topic, and he has a published and well-respected method and control for laying in a breather crimp. And I don't want to do any disservice to that. You should look for Martin Nash's Infinity Crimp and his Infinity Control and find that material. He has a video series, I think it's called Infinity and Beyond. And he has another one. I think he covers it on a series called The Charming Cheat, where he talks a bit about his control for laying in a breather crimp. I will show you something that is available in print that comes kind of close, and I think it's fair to point it out. I already alluded to it in my first description when I talked about Erdnase and creating a bridge. There is a figure in there that demonstrates this kind of crimp, where you push down on half of the packet to get a concave bend in there, and then you square such that someone, a Confederate, would be able to dead cut to that bridge that was made and nullify a cut. Why not do that with one card? Right? Why not do that with one card? And that's all I'll say. I don't want to get into the nuance, ideas about that, but I will point you to that. There is a way there in published format that is freely available in common domain, public domain, that demonstrates the concept of laying in a breather crimp. It's actually, in this case, is a breather crimp that will cut as a key card, right? So it's not a reversed breather, but a breather. A reverse breather, you would need to do it the other way, right? Such that you are taking one card and you're putting the bridge into that one card in a very similar manner. You can play around with that and sort of figure out how to make that work. So that's a breather crimp, an impromptu way to lay one in that is in a public domain material there, if we just get creative with that description. Very quickly to review a version of the breather crimp that I use that can be laid in an impromptu fashion on the table. I find that I can locate cards via an impromptu breather just by giving the deck a bit of a bridge in the motion of gathering cards up. So to demonstrate the point here, we'll take just a random card out. And you can see that this is the Four of Hearts. We put it on top, and in the action of gathering cards together, which might be after a shuffle, so if we just shuffle to retain the card on top, I can bend very, very starkly, this is behind the cover of fingers, the top half or quarter of the deck and give it a pretty good bend like that. And then what happens is if we juxtapose this arched sort of section of the deck with the flat bottom, we can retain a breather that it stays pretty well in place. Even if you press down on the deck, I can still cut right to that card. And because it is reversed, I can cut to the card rather than cut just one above it. So in practice, what that looks like is this. Let's say we have Five of Diamonds there, and we need to have a justification for gathering the cards, so there's a bit of a false strip cut there, and I've already done it. I've laid it in, and now when I cut, I'll cut to my Five of Diamonds. So I have found this through practice to be a very reliable sort of crimp to put an arch in the top section of the deck and then juxtapose that against the bottom section of the deck. So that's another impromptu sort of crimp that can be done on the table right in front of viewers, and nobody's the wiser to it. Let's look now at some other types of crimps that are single card crimps that don't deal with the middle of the card, but rather with the border of the card. Essentially, these crimps go by name in most printed contexts by the place in which the crimp occurs. So you have corner crimps or edge crimps, and that's what we'll look at next. Ways to in an impromptu setting, lay in one of these kinds of crimps, and then also how to use them in terms of location and cutting when the time needs to be to control that card. The following is an example of a type of corner crimp, that is just a crimp that is put into just a corner of the card, that can be done to a spectator selection or a selection that's being either shown from a spread or returned to a spread. And it can be done in two different fashions. One fashion might be that you are having a card selected. Let's say a spectator points to this card or touches this card, and you show the card on its face. In this case, it's the 8 of spades. And from behind the spread, as you distinguish that card above or hold it out, you take your thumb on the left hand and you just crimp up the corner. And this is completely hidden. And it only takes a second. Just be aggressive with your crimps to make sure that they can be discovered later on when you need to. And then you close the spread up. And the action there is that a card was freely selected, shown in a spread, and the spread was closed, and there was no sort of finagling going on. Well, the interesting thing about this is that you can, at this point, because the crimp is nearest you, you can see what that crimp looks like. Note that the corner goes up. So if I was to divide this, I would divide it at the corner, pulling up at the break, and my card of interest would go to the bottom of the top packet coming off. If I wanted to retain that at top, what I would need to do is come here to the edge, and you see how the corner goes up into the corner, but then it comes down here, and there's a second sort of layer of separation. I would want to cut there and cut it to the top, as you can see as that goes. But the nice thing about this is that because it's on the near edge, I can simply hand the deck to the spectator. From their perspective, they see nothing. Not that people would ever really notice these crimps anyway, but I can say to the spectator, would you mind giving them a shuffle? And I can hand it to them, and they can copy that motion. And then as I take it back, I still have the crimp right in my line of sight. It's not in theirs, but it's in mine. And then I can do whatever I want as I get it back. I can cut it to the bottom or cut it to the top and then use it. So that's one way to lay in a corner crimp. That is, again, a card is freely touched or selected and then maybe out-jogged and then shown to the spectator. And as that's done, as they're acquiring the identity, I can quickly crimp up the corner, close up the spread, and ask them, would you mind shuffling the cards? And then I turn the cards over to them and they shuffle. And as I take it back, it's right in my line of sight to see where that's at. And I can cut it again to the top or the bottom, whatever the case may be. A lot of people will talk about removing crimps. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but if you get your hands on the part where the crimp is at, either in the reveal, let's say you turn it over and you show it, my crimp is now on this side, it's a good opportunity there to grab it by the corner and then just give it a press or a bend and sort of smooth that out. And what you do is you can remove the crimp in that situation. A very similar kind of crimp that is done not on the top of the spread but is done underneath can look like this. Same kind of thing. A card is touched or selected. Now what I can do is I can feel underneath the inside corner right here. And I'll show you this from the underside. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that inside corner that's covered up and I'm just going to press with my two ring fingers together like that to create my crimp. It's a downward crimp. In this fashion, and I can do something very similar. I can either show it to the spectator, and I'm covering the crimp at this point as I show it, or the card can be placed back in to the spread, and I can lay in my crimp that way, and then close the spread up. And again, because it's facing me, I can give it a quick mix, and then I can pass that over to the spectator to do the same, and their side of the deck is clean, whereas my side of the deck shows the crimp. Same thing again, I want to look out for how I manage this, because this crimp goes down. If I cut it at the corner, the card will go to the top. If I want it to go to the bottom, I'll want to cut it inside of that corner on this secondary division here. So again, the crimp goes downward in this case. So if I want it to go to the bottom, I would need to cut it here inside that corner to get that card to the bottom. And if I want to cut it to the top, I would cut it just above, at the corner, just above that break, and then cut it to the top, and I have control over it. Again, this one's a little easier to rub out, because as I show the card, I can grab naturally to that inside corner, and I can give it a squeeze and show it that way. Another crimp, one other crimp that you can use is one where this is called a gambler's crimp. It's made in the action of displaying a card or holding a card, and you're very simply, all you're going to do is you're going to take the corner, and you're going to push with your thumb in between your index finger and middle finger, and create sort of this bend right here. So it's a slightly different kind of crimp. I might do this as I pick the card up and turn it over. And now I've laid my crimp, and it's not seen. It can't really be seen or identified from the other side. Or I might do it as I'm placing a card back into the deck. In this case, if I take it from this corner, I'm laying my crimp the opposite way, and I place it back into the deck. Now what I have is I have this situation where I have a slight division down here where I've laid my crimp. Now, this crimp is kind of different, because what it's doing is it's laying in kind of this lateral or oblique sort of a crimp to the corner. It's not pulling the corner up or down, but rather it's putting a fold in it that's going at the corner. So what this looks like in view is a little bit different. What you have here is a break at the corner, where if I wanted to cut it to the top, I would try to split it there above the corner, but then on either side, just past the corner, I would be easily cutting it to the bottom. So it's very important, I think, I can't impress this enough, that you know what the crimp is doing to the card whenever you're using a crimp, that you know what it's doing to the card, and you know how it presents as you're looking at the break, so that you can naturally, quickly, and efficiently, and without any kind of suspicion, you can cut the card to the location that you choose without having to think about it. So whatever crimps you decide on, you want to make sure that you are aware of what the crimp actually is doing to the card, so that you can manage it properly and quickly without being noticed and without fiddling around. Okay. Another crimp. This is another good one too. I use this one quite a bit. It looks kind of like this from a spread. A spectator will select a card or point to a card, and you up jog the card, and then at the moment of placing it in or showing it out jogged, ace of spades here, what you're going to do is you're going to tilt it slightly so that they're looking at the indice here, and they're trying to remember that, right? You're showing it one more time where it goes into the pack. And from the spectator's view, it looks like this, right? Like you're pressing it in like that. But from my left hand, what I'm doing is I'm pressing up, and I'm going to crimp the corner against the rest of the deck. And this is all under cover as it goes in, and then I have an up corner crimp, just like I've demonstrated before. So another very good crimp that can be used much like one of the other spread crimps, corner crimps that I demonstrated. Some final thoughts on this idea of crimping. really, the technique for crimping is to get a hold of a card and put a bend in it any way that's manageable to you, that makes sense. So you need not merely put in a crimp on the corner via a bend or some kind of a pinch. You can crimp a card anywhere, as long as you know, again, as long as you know what the crimp is doing to the card and then how to manage it after the fact. So, for example, if I had a card freely selected and laid on a table, I could pick the card up and I could lay my crimp in here as I demonstrate the card. What I'm doing is I'm laying the crimp in on the side. So I would crimp the card, and then I would, as I show it, and then I would place it into the deck. And what I have here is a crimp that's right here with kind of a little V shape. If I cut at the V, I'm cutting the card to the top. If I cut to any side of the V, either side of the V, I'm cutting the card to the bottom. So, again, whatever you come up with, any way that you can manage to give a bend to the card in any place, as long as you know what that bend is doing, and then intuitively you know how to manage that after the fact, you're in a good shape. What you shouldn't do is in impromptu fashion, without having tested and practiced, have a card, selected or whatever, just pick it up and put a bend in it anywhere and stick it in and then try to figure out how to deal with that in the moment. You want to practice your motions and your moves and your cover such that whatever it is you're doing, not only do you know how to put it in an undetected way, but you also know what it looks like when you go to look for it, and you can very quickly cut however you would need to manage that crimped card. So those are my general thoughts on crimped cards. Very, very powerful. You think about it for a moment, you can use a crimped card as a key card, so you need not even crimp the card of interest. You could crimp a card next to it in an impromptu fashion from a shuffled deck in use. You could do that. You can use it to find a location to give yourself control so that you are controlling a card for a revelation that's down the road in the presentation. You can also crimp a card to be presented immediately through some kind of reveal, such as with dead cutting from a breather crimp. There are endless sorts of ways that you can use this idea to understand the location of any cards of interest within a deck just by putting a bend into a card. And again, this is something you can do with a borrowed deck, and you do not ruin the deck. Putting a crimp into a card, so long as you're not creating a crease or you're not stretching the plastic in any way, you will not ruin the card. The card will be able to go back to its normal form through regular shuffling and handling, and you can turn that back over after you've borrowed those cards. So anyway, that's all I have for you today on the topic of crimped cards. Please comment in the comment section below, and feel free to get a discussion going on this topic. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and I wish you happy magicking.